Welcome to Marathon Champions, the podcast where running legends Benji Durden, Bill Rogers, and Ron Tabb share their timeless wisdom on marathon training and inspire listeners with their wealth of experience. These champions continue to impact the running world today. Now, let's pass the mic to your MC, Letty Lundquist, to kick off this journey of enduring inspiration.
Hello and welcome back, everybody, to episode 3 of this podcast. My name is Letty Lundquist. I also host the Marathon Running Podcast. But today, in this very podcast, we're going to talk about environmental factors when it comes to running. So I invite you to stay and have a listen to what these legends have to say in regards to that.
Dude, so let's talk about environment.
All right.
So, Billy just brought up in a side conversation, he never trained at altitude. I didn't either. Ron, did you ever go to altitude?
I ran no, I never trained there. I went to Colorado Springs for the sports festival twice, and it just was against the way I you guys know how I like to train. I liked fast splits. Yeah. I like 10-mile. I like 51-minute 10-milers, and I couldn't do that at Colorado Springs.
You can't do that easily. And it's not just about altitude. There's all kinds of environmental situations that affect us both in training and in racing. But, I personally, for years, and I don't know if this has any reality whatsoever, but I personally, for years, felt like altitude training is useful, but it's more useful if you were born there and have a family history from there. You look at the Eastern Africans, and they're from altitude. Now, is it because of other genetic factors or being born at altitude? I don't know. And you look at the Americans that have been good over the decades, and a lot of them are from altitude.
Yes.
Be the guys from Utah were, like Paul Cummings and Ed Eyestone.
Yes.
And, it's just
Padilla, Henry Marsh.
They were from altitude. Now, it may be because we didn't have altitude camps back then. And so in more recent years, we've had people have camps at altitude. And it seems like there might be some benefit to that. But I don't know that anybody's done significant research. They do know kind of how much it hurts you if you go from sea level to altitude, but it doesn't. Now, I now have been in Colorado since 1985, and I go to sea level and I don't run much faster.
Well, that's because you're such an old timer, Benji.
Yeah, it's true. But back when I was still running semi-decent, from Colorado to Atlanta, I didn't run much faster.
You mean for a 10K?
For a 10K, not for marathons. And I don't know how much altitude would help marathoning. Because marathoning is not simply about oxygen uptake. There's other energy requirements that make oxygen uptake alone, even though we know it has an important factor because EPO seems to help so much.
Well, look at the Mexico City Games, Benji. That turned out to be considered a fiasco by the Olympic organization, unfortunately, and a tragedy that not only that, but politically for the country of Mexico, and because it was a debatable issue amongst the people of Mexico, whether this is a positive for the country of Mexico to have the Olympic Games there. And a lot of poor people lost their homes, I think, to raise the way for the Olympic grounds, but a lot of great champions like Ron Clark or George Young did. Ron Clark,
Jim Ryan
running at altitude against Kip Keino and all that. Would he have beaten him at sea level? I don't know, but they were a great racing pair. But I think we now know we're not probably going to have the Olympic Games at altitude again, are we?
Well, I wouldn't think so, but then I wouldn't have thought we would have world championships in Dubai.
We'll have some great pole vaulting and high jumping at altitude.
Or long jump.
Long jump, yeah.
And the javelin throw.
Yeah, but and then there's other factors. I brought up Dubai, heat. And so how do you deal with that? You can't you can prepare. Let's say we have a meet that's going to be at altitude. You can prepare for that. You can go and train at altitude for a bit and prepare for that. Well, so Orlando and probably Paris and almost every Olympic Games, heat's going to be a factor. So how do you prepare for that? Well, one way is...
Well, Benji, you and I both trained in cities, in areas that were renowned for heat and humidity. I mean, Atlanta and Houston for me. And, we both ran the trials in 80, where there was, a heat factor there that year. And, we did pretty well at the trials in 80. And I think that probably be attributed to the fact that we were running in you training in Atlanta, me training in Houston.
And me wearing a lot of clothing.
And you were
that's a great point, Ron and Benji, and will be a factor in our Olympic trials too. And it reminds me of when Dick Beardsley raced Alberto Salazar in the extreme heat of the 1982 Boston Marathon. I was in that race as well. And, you're
in the early pictures.
What's that?
You're in the early pictures.
Yeah. I was third until a mile ago, until John Lodwick from Texas, he was used to the heat. So he edged me, So I think you're absolutely right, Benji and Ron and Letty, for us to talk about this and how this is going to be a factor at the trials, I think.
Well, it's also a factor for just the everyday runner, for people that, just on their personal journeys.
Yes.
One of the things, all the environmental things that can happen in a race and or training for that matter, you have to take those factors into consideration when you think about, okay, how's the day going to go? How am I going to run this race? Is it going to be a race that I've got to dial back my expectations? Is this a race I got to, do something different? I mean, for cold, you put on a little bit more clothing. For heat, you try to get as little, but at the same time, I run in long sleeve shirts regardless of the day. No, not races I don't, but for training, let's say it's 100 degrees. I still have a long sleeve shirt on minimum because one, sweat will evaporate from the shirt to help be cooling, but also, that radiant heat on your skin is bad. It makes you hotter, and people don't think about that.
And there is such a thing called melanoma,
which I have a scar that I'm getting my stitches out tomorrow because of a small melanoma. And, and then the wind. What do you do with wind? I mean, I hate the wind. What do you do? There's nothing you can do.
Benji,
you draft.
Years ago,
I get behind
us to go out with facing the wind so it could push us coming home, and we could run harder then. That's one way to deal with it. Also, when you have run, let's say you're doing an 8-mile run, if you're sweating after 4 miles, and you don't want to be sweating going into the wind, so that's something that beginning runners
Another factor. If it's a cold, windy day with a little bit of rain,
it can get you.
Yeah, but you got to think about that. You got to consider, okay, what do I do if I'm out there and I'm suddenly, I have some runs I do where I know it's going to be windy, and I stay near home. So if I have to, I can bail. And I have, wind screens from the streets. And you think about, you try to plan ahead. If you're in a race, drafting is important, but, a lot of the races these days, if you're slow enough, you got plenty of people to run with. If you're too fast, you're kind of out there on your own. Rain. I hated the rain too. I mean,
in the late 70s, Frank Shorter started a running gear clothing line. I started mine the next year simply because there wasn't much good quality running gear. Ron Hill from England was first doing this, and I think Frank got the okay from Olin Cassell that he could start a business. When I started our clothing line with my brother and 3 other partners, put our money into this business quest, to have better quality running gear, with
Wish you still had your gear out there. I'd buy your gear if it was still out there.
Yeah. So I think that, and then the shoe companies saw what was going on and said, hey, we're going to get into this too. It's a big business and all, and they did. But I think what my point is to the runners, the beginners, is don't nickel and dime yourself. you might not need that $250 pair of running shoes, but you should have some good shoes. And go to your local running store, support them, and get some good quality gear. And take your time selecting your shoes. Lace up both pairs of shoes, walk in them, jogging them a little bit outside the store. And I think because this is it. This is how we roll, right? I mean, you know what I'm saying, Ron?
Yeah, you don't want to wear the same shoes for racing as you do for your training. I know that some runners, I think Letty, I think you're an example that you wear your the shoes that you race in are the same shoes that you race in. The Nike.
No.
The,
So I race
the
in
Nike
racing shoes, the Alpha Flies. I absolutely
Alpha
love
Fly.
them. Yeah, they just sent me the newest pair, which by the way is the Alpha Fly 3s, and they're absolutely amazing. I mean, the forward propel is amazing. So I only wear those shoes for racing, but once they are retired, and I'm putting in air quotes, then they become my fast run training shoes because, you can only put 200 to 300 miles on those shoes before they start, getting unglued and really not being that fresh anymore. And so then they become part of my training rotation. But yeah, no, I'm a big advocate of having a certain pair of popping racing shoes that will make you feel lighter on the day of your race.
Yeah,
Sure,
I'm not an example at all. I wore Nike Eagles for training and racing, and I wore them a long time. I'd get over 1,000 miles a pair of Nike.
So you wore the same shoes to race in?
Same shoes.
Really?
I threw away a pair of shoes because the uppers wore out. In Atlanta, they'd get too wet, and the uppers would finally just wear out. The bottoms, but I am not at all somebody you should look at and say, well, what is
Benji? I have one question for you. When you blew out your plantar fascia, do you think that was attributable to your wearing racing shoes in your long runs and training and pushing it all the time?
No. The plantar fascia injury was due to an extreme blister. I had a very, very bad blood blister, and it was due to a small wrinkle in the ball of the sock liner.
Yeah.
And I didn't notice it when I was running in Atlanta because I ran in at like 50, 60 miles just to make sure the shoes were okay. But I ran on a semi-flat course. And so I didn't feel the wrinkle. But running Boston, sliding across that wrinkle for, the number of miles I ran across it, it finally caused a blood blister. So it was the shoe's fault, but it wasn't the specific model of shoe. And it wasn't using the shoes as training.
And you still ran your PR that day?
Yeah, I would have run. Greg and I would have been
impressive.
Competing all the way to the end, I think, if I hadn't had that blood blister. It was a good day. I mean, Joni set the world record and Greg ran 209 flat. It was a good day. It was, definitely, that was one of Boston's better weather days. But
yeah, it's so. See, I guess what I'm just trying to say here, and our conversation is so interesting because we all have some little bit of variety with this. We all know the new shoes, they call them the super shoes, are so key, and I just wonder at what point, I know that supposedly older runners, we don't do so well in those shoes. But I guess the point we're trying to make to our listeners is, take your time with your shoes and have fun with them. And Letty, you're enjoying your racing and your training. I did a fair amount of racing. I did a lot of road racing, maybe 30 races a year in my racing shoes, but I also did speed work in my racing shoes, like on the track or something.
Yeah.
So we all had that certain component to our training. And I always liked a lightweight trainer. I used to wear a shoe kind of like the Asics DS trainer, which is what I wear a lot of the times now. But I guess it's brave new world in the running shoes, but we know they're playing a role. And I guess what we can say to the runners is just go to a running store where you really can learn the staff and you get along good and all that, and then you're going to get the shoes you really want.
Yeah.
So Bill and Benji, did either of you with your track workouts, and I only started doing track workouts when I started training with Coach Dillinger, but did you guys use spikes in your track workouts or just flats?
I never wore
In my
spikes.
career, I used spikes, but once I got to, where I was regionally ranked as well as and later nationally ranked, I just ran my flats. Spikes, if you're going to run on the track and you're going to run, although these days they're running in alpha flies and vapor flies for 10,000 track, but spikes do help for short middle distance events, but your calves take a beating. I've had a pair of spikes since I guess 2004, I think.
So that's a good point. You really got to get used to spikes.
Yeah,
when I ran the Olympic trials 10,000 in 76, I hadn't worn a pair of spikes. I think I ran one 10,000 Coach Squires had me do at the Philadelphia Relays, where I took second to Dick Berkeley, great champion, super nice guy, Atlanta guy. And
at that time, I think he was still back up in New England. I think he was Syracuse.
He was in Rochester, New York.
Rochester.
But I wasn't really prepared for them, but I certainly enjoyed them. You could really motor in spikes. But later I developed a foot metatarsalgia injury because I ran the trials. I was the fastest guy in the 10K trials, like an idiot. I'm not a track guy. I didn't know what I was doing. I was totally winging it.
It probably is why you had trouble at Montreal.
It could be the metatarsalgia, and these are the kind of things that, that we're kind of saying to the runners out there that your shoes are important, but be careful with them,
So here's we talk about shoes, but the other side of it, preparing for, training weather, I have trouble these days finding clothing that I really think is appropriate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there, but I can't find tights that are comfortable. There are no reasonable, to me, wind suits anymore. Everything is just too heavy. I mean, I want a lightweight windsuit if I'm going to run in a windy day. And, I've had to go more to camping gear, like North Face, find stuff there. I just, when Billy was selling his,
it was the big companies like Nike or Brooks or Asics.
Well, it may be that just the stores aren't carrying them for me. And I don't want to order online because I have no clue what it's going to be like. I want to be able to feel it. And it's a challenge these days for me. And maybe it is for others to find all weather clothing.
Do you think that's true for a lot of the runners today? I think for real beginners, your clothing is key.
Yeah.
And depending where you live, if you live in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, where it's really cold.
You just named a place where there are probably only about 150 runners.
But you know what I'm saying? You got to have your gear. I mean, I remember Dick Beardsley telling me about his days in Minnesota and Gary Bjorklund and Jan Edel and all the runners from that area of our country and how do you run
Dick Beardsley ended up coming down to Atlanta during those times of the year.
And, that brings me to the point. He trained in Atlanta with a great marathoner from Atlanta area, whose name I'll often forget. He's real skinny, but they trained
Dean Matthews.
Dean Matthews.
Yeah.
They trained in the hills and in the heat of Atlanta in the spring so Dick could challenge Alberto at Boston.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah.
That where you train is so key.
Well, yeah, but that's you're talking to people at the elite level because they have the wherewithal to go. If you're talking to somebody like you said, South Dakota, they got to train in South Dakota. They can't.
I used to wear long underwear on my run.
I was going to say, Bill. So when we were in college, we used to get long underwear and tie dyeing. So. I
remember Frank Shorter and Jack Batchelor wearing pantyhose in one of the cross country meets that was really, really brutal because that was what they could do.
At the NCAA championships, cross country championships in '76, Steve Scott, who you guys are familiar with, former American record holder in the mile, Ralph Cerna, Eric Hulse, they were from Southern California, UC Irvine. And we had nationals in Springfield, Missouri that year. they came out, and it's funny because I've got pictures of, just went back to a reunion back there with those guys this past summer. But they came out and they went shopping and bought pantyhose to wear during the cross country race because they knew it was, November in Springfield, Missouri is going to be really cold. And so they were wearing, we're looking at them thinking, because I'm from Missouri originally and, ran college in Missouri. And, so we're used to the cold. We didn't wear anything on our legs. We had acclimated to the cold weather, similar to the canyon's altitude. The altitude doesn't seem to bother them. No, the cold really didn't bother us because that's where we were from. The Southern California boys, they didn't really care for that, the temperatures in the teens.
My first ever half marathon was as a college sophomore, and I ran with Andy Burfoot, 68 Boston Marathon champion. He was prepping for Boston. This is in like February or March in Connecticut, and where we went to college all, and where Jeff Galloway also went to college, interestingly, Atlanta guy. And I was wearing my grandfather's letter sweater from football from Monmouth, Illinois, where we went to college. And then I had on those big, heavy gray pants. Well, I froze myself strategically, and I froze to death. I said, I'm not doing this again. This is for the birds. And I don't think I ran a half marathon for another 5 years, because we didn't have good gear. So I think one of the reasons why people are achieving a higher level and why everyone can benefit, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it too, Letty, because you talk with a lot of people. Where are they getting their gear? Is at Lululemon or Nike, Adidas? I mean, this is a big question. We're kind of out of that loop right now.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays with the return policies being so easy, yes, there's Lululemon and the big brands, but almost all of them included are available on Amazon. So usually when I try to find a pair of tights or whatever, because I'm going somewhere cold, I just order 5 pairs of them. And then the ones that don't fit, I just return them. And it's, it's kind of like if you go to your local running store, and I'm all about supporting them, there's so many things with running stores. They can't carry certain brands because in the radios of this area, they can't overlap with another vendor. And then if you don't have the typical runner's body, then stuff just doesn't fit. So I think online is great options nowadays. And then if you follow a lot of runners on Facebook, on Instagram too, you see their choices of branding. So that's kind of how they first pop in your head. But I would say Amazon keywords, running tights that are whatever you want them to be, and something will come up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Our mutual friend, Tom Fleming, his daughter, Margot, works for Lululemon. She used to work for Nike, but she's an ultra runner. And I remember her first ever marathon was at the Philadelphia Marathon. I was there with Tom. This is about 7 or 8 years ago. It was 27 degrees, freezing cold. Well, how do you dress for that in the marathon? Well, you better have a pair of good mittens. You need a hat to keep your body heat and your head comfortable and not freeze. And yet you don't want to bundle up too much. You always have to. So in other words, it's kind of it's a very important issue. And so I think it's good for us to talk about it for the beginners, in particular. But we've had our struggles too with it. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, I remember running the Eisenhower Marathon. I can't remember what year it was, but back in the 2010 range, maybe 2005 range, somewhere in there. And we had a really, really strong wind in one direction. It was an out and back course, and it was like 19 degrees. And so in one direction, you had to have a lot of clothing on. The other direction, the clothing was a hindrance. And what do? You just have to figure one way or the other, you're going to be suffering, and just prepare yourself mentally to suffer. But yeah, environmental factors in a race, you just have to mentally do what you can with gear, and then also do what you can mentally to try to say, okay, this is what it's going to take today. And if the environment is unfriendly, you have to accept that the environment's unfriendly and not be pig-headed, not push yourself into a hole just because you're unwilling to accept the reality of the circumstances.
And also, look at the way wind played a role. Remember, Ron, when you and I ran Toronto Marathon? I remember you because I finally got the edge on you that day.
Well, yeah. Toronto was the same for me. I remember running Toronto in '83, and my foot was already a problem, and it was pretty windy, and nobody wanted to take the lead. And if I'd go to the front and try to break away, because I was easily the cream of the crop. I mean, on paper, there was no reason I should be concerned by anybody in the field, and they just all lined up behind me. So I just slowed down the pace, and finally we got to where we had a little pack, and then I ran hard the last bit of the race. But if you get in a situation where it's really windy, you got to find some way to have some help from other runners, because there's nothing else going to help you.
I think what we're trying to say, that it doesn't matter your level in this sport, the weather affects us all. Yeah. And therefore, take your time getting some gear you really like and experiment with shorter distances, maybe in extreme conditions. Don't mess with the cold or the heat or humidity. And I think most of the races now, for example, the summer road races started at 8 a.m. Back in our day, I remember the first time I ran the Krim 10 miler, 1977, 12 noon, 95
Boston
degrees.
was noon for forever.
What was that?
Boston,
yes,
started at noon forever. I don't know when it's changed, but in '83 we started at noon.
And I think all the runners who ran Boston then would go home to their road race, and these are people who started a lot of the major road races in America because they ran Boston and said, I want to do this in my city or my town, which is wonderful. Let's start it at 12 noon. So they thought the people who ran the Boston Marathon, the BAA, really knew what they were doing. But of course, the real truth is they didn't. It was only the runners who knew what they were doing. But they were.
I think this is a great place to wrap it up with the whole, what Benji was saying, pretty much kind of mind over matter, right? You have the environment that you're living in, and you can't really do anything to defy it. Wear good clothing, but then just kind of get over it and run anyway, because that's what you want to do.
Yep.
We hope that you enjoyed what you heard. And if you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share. And your support means everything. And until next time, embrace the journey and take care. Happy listening.